everybody, Gurmy's Coaster Yard here, and in today's episode of Germanator Studios, we will be completing work on our log flume. And to start, we are working on the show building section. Now this will be, to the best of my memory, the smallest show building that we build in this park, at least so far. And what I'm doing to start is basically outlining the roof, because I know that some of the ceilings will be different heights, and I just wanted to figure out what the border of the building would be first and foremost. And this also helps because as you build, and as it gives you sort of time to think about the shape and size of your build. For instance, there you can see where I placed a roof over top of the slightly higher section, and that led me to realize that the outline on the lower portion was a little bit too far out, one by one tile. So you'll see me delete that here in a moment. But anyway, so that's what we are working on now, and yeah, pretty straightforward and kind of boring. I was kind of hoping this would be over a little faster, so I could get on with something more interesting. But anyway, hopefully it's interesting to you guys, I guess. Anyway, yes, okay, so now I realized that I didn't want a big place for water to collect along the side of the mountain, between the mountain and the show building. So along here you can see me raising up the terrain to ensure that it is level with the height of the roof. And actually you'll notice that it's black in color, and if you know anything about this series, I use black as the color for ceilings in my show buildings because maybe for obvious reasons, but if it's not obvious, just because that color is easy to hide, especially in custom lit environments. So in a real life dark ride where you have custom lighting on the various show elements, a black ceiling would be perfect. And I think that's kind of the same reason, arena ceilings or concert hall ceilings are dark in color. It's the same thing of helping to absorb light and not have it bounce all around. That's my best guess. I'm not a lighting technician, so don't quote me there. And if you are a lighting technician, let me know how good of an explanation that is. But anyway, point being, that's the ceiling. A very long-winded explanation for something I've already kind of explained before. And the roof, of course, will be gray in color, as we've done in the past. So, sorry if I got a little carried away there. Anyhow, now we are placing the walls, and again, not much to explain. However, yeah, I can't even come up with a however. So, yeah, I guess one thing I'll comment on is that you can see I made the ceiling just one block wide in the section I'm working on now. And initially, I was just going to have the building there be that narrow, but I decided, for the sake of maintenance and catwalk purposes, or that's just sort of the explanation in my mind, I decided to have it a little wider, and just to make sure that the building was not right up against the ride support structure. And that also leaves some room for a spiral staircase we'll build here in a little bit for maintenance purposes, as well as egress. So that's obviously an important thing to consider in your designs, is if the ride breaks down or if there's some emergency and guests are inside of the building, how are they going to get out safely? And you've seen me do egress for some of my other attractions, specifically the haunted house, and I believe we did it. Yeah, we did it for the dinosaur dark ride, and of course, in the the show building for our launch coaster that we did way back at the beginning of this series. Um, we had sort of exit paths in each of those, and considered locations for the doorways and everything. So that's, again, just something to consider, but we will touch more on that later in this video when we work a little more on the interior of this building. And right now we're just finishing up the ceilings on the inside, and soon we'll move on to the roofs. But that soon is not quite yet, I guess. Anyway, um, yes. So one thing I'm doing right here, and I totally messed up here, as you'll see, I placed those tiles way too low. Um, However, we needed a platform for our little show piece in here, the little outlaw animatronic, and so that's pretty straightforward. I don't think I have to explain why I'm building that, but you can see I'm just using our girder pieces, and or I guess they're scaffolding pieces. I don't remember the girder pieces. I think they are girder pieces. Sorry. Anyway, it's late if you couldn't tell, and just trying to sort of spice this up a little bit with some shrubbery, and we had some tumbleweeds and just some various things to make it look good. And of course, as I've mentioned before, lighting in RollerCoaster Tycoon 3 is very restrictive. So obviously, it doesn't look like a heavily themed environment, but the idea is that the main focus of the lighting would be um, on that little scene in there. That's just something to make the backwards lift hill a little more interesting, and I'm pretty proud of how this whole set piece turns out in the end. And yeah, not much else to explain there. In a moment, we'll put those girder pieces back in, and of course, when you don't know the exact height of something like a roof and you need to build a wall that gets right to that height or a stack of girders, you can always start at the top and work your way down one piece at a time. That will tell you the height of the bottom one that you need. But moving on, this is probably one of the biggest things we do in today's episode is working on the sight lines, not only from the perspective of riders, but also from the perspective of guests. So we want to make sure that this show building is virtually invisible, and I say virtually because it would take a lot of time and effort that I'm not willing to put in to look at every single possible angle a guest could view this ride. So I really focused on the angles from within the western area and from on board the ride itself to make sure that everything looked good. But anyway, you can see we're going along the outside edge here of the walls where it's visible to guests, and just covering it up with terrain. And of course, in a moment we'll paint this terrain and make it a little more jagged looking, just to make it look more realistic, and so there's no flat line at the top. And then we'll go through with our free cam to look at it from the guest perspective and make sure that the show building is not visible. And spoiler alert, the first time we do that, the show building is definitely visible from multiple angles. Um, but hopefully you'll be able to see the technique I use. It's really straightforward. I mean, the bulk of it is just using the free cam to look at the project from some different angles and make sure that it's not visible. But to start, really what I was doing was just going through all the areas I knew it would probably be visible from, or the areas where I knew I needed masking sight lines, and just brought the terrain up because I knew it was going to need to come up eventually. Now you can see me going through with the free cam, trying to get about to the level of the guests and dragging the terrain up. And along here I found what I thought needed to be the minimum height, and then I realized eventually I can go into I don't really know what the menu is called, but it's the little pair of sunglasses there on the top left. Um, you can go in there and find right here sort of a topographical outline that indicates terrain heights, and I use that to sort of try and figure out about what height I needed the various terrain to be to mask that building. Of course, I also realized I could go through from in the free cam at that level and adjust terrain heights and mask everything manually in a non-calculated way. And you'll notice here I'm doing that along the outside edge too. That way this environment sort of gets masked from the outside and the outside gets masked from this environment. That way riders don't feel like they're in the middle of a theme park when they're on this attraction. Aside from the one spot right there where we have our little wall and fence and they can sort of look out. But beyond that, Hopefully they won't feel that way. Anyhow, now I'm just adding a little more shrubbery, just trying to make the plant life a little more dense up here and maybe feel a little bit more natural. I know it doesn't completely feel that way, so that may be a future project. Um, Although, for the most part, this project will be done by the end of this episode, as you will see. Anyway, I'm just going along here, doing a little more work on the terrain on the edge of this building. Um, I realize now as I narrate that I never put the roof on the building yet, nor did we color the exterior walls. In fact, we have not even placed the exterior walls, but that is something we will do later on in this episode. I think pretty soon. Not that it matters. We'll get to it when we get to it. But here you can see me along the ground level, trying to mask the taller section of this building. And I realized when I was done with that if it was visible from the ride in that position, it was probably also visible from the pathway. So I went down here to the pathway and brought the terrain up until it was masking all the height of that building. And one thing to consider is that the further away guests are from the sight line, the more they will be able to see behind it. So you really want to get as far away as you reasonably can to figure out your sight lines. Here, it's probably a little bit further than we needed to go, but I went back to the dinosaur section and looked across the lake. And at that point, the in-game view settings really prohibited me from seeing anything back there. But that's just a technique. Find the furthest point that a guest will be looking at and paying attention to an attraction like this, or paying attention to the details of a sightline, and use that furthest reasonable point as your reference for figuring out how you need to mask things or how you need to make them look their best from that angle and from any angles closer up. But when working with terrain, as I did here, especially, I think that's the best advice I can give. Anyhow, right now, of course, we are working on the rooftop to our show building, and this is just like every other roof we've done, so I'm not going to try and explain it uselessly, because I feel like useless explanation is something I've become quite good at. Anyhow, you'll notice along here, due to the weird height of the wall pieces, I just had to delete a couple to place doorways, and then go back with some 2/3 height walls to make sure that everything looked good in the end. And now we are using our favorite color, Go Away Green, just to make the exterior of this building not look so dark and gothic. Not that there's anything wrong with being a goth or whatever, but it doesn't look so great for a show building's exterior, and especially if that means it's visible to guests. So this will just help mask the building as long as it's visible to guests at any point. And hopefully we'll be able to do some work with sightlines to prevent that from happening. But what I'm doing right here is adding the little flat western roof underneath these supports to create a space where guests can walk through, and then using green color 1/3 height walls, as we've done in other show buildings, to indicate an exit path for the ride. And we have a couple of those leading to both exits. And this is a pretty straightforward thing. I've done it before, um, but it's relatively effective. Anyhow, now we are getting along to the point where I decided to build a staircase. So I went to the western wall set and got a staircase, and just brought it up to the height of the upper track, and placed those girders along the outside. And again, this is like other spiral stairways that we've built, so it's nothing too crazy. And finally in here I decided to put some mist for some ambience, and just to sort of set the mood, and also to help sort of mask things we don't, like mask the walls and just things we wouldn't necessarily want guests to be paying attention to. And finally, we're putting doors on the outside. And I believe that's where we leave things with the show building itself, aside from painting the trim here, that Go Away Green color, just to be consistent. And this looks a lot like our other show buildings. Ah, yes, I did forget some walls on the little L shape, I guess we'll call it. So I'm putting those in now. Anyway, this is, like I said, it's a lot like the other show buildings that we've done, and the process is the same. It's just a little bit different when you're working with a natural terrain build like this, and you need to mask the show building with the terrain. But ultimately, from the perspective of guests, using these techniques is pretty effective, and it's a good way to have a realistic ride environment. And doing something like cave is so much easier inside of a show building than it is doing it within the terrain of Roller Coaster Tycoon. Now, there are ways to approach that, in some ways I have in mind, and some things I've thought about if I wanted to do. Um, we have parts that go into the terrain on this ride, and I've thought about maybe trying to decorate them, and I have ideas in mind for how to accomplish that, and I may approach that in the future. But the point is, when you can do most of that interior stuff in a show building, it makes your life so much easier, especially if you can do it where the show building is out of sight to the guests, or if it's not apparent that the show building is part of that terrain attraction. In this case, the terrain being our little fake mountain. Anyhow, we're moving along to decorating this little portion, our little mini western town, if you want to call it that. Well, it has a name. It's Chinchilla, New Mexico, since this is themed to Bandito Mountain. So, and of course, if this happens to be the first episode you're watching, Bandito Mountain is a no limits project I made. Anyhow, we're just bringing the terrain up to mask the lip of that slate square piece. I don't remember what the actual name of it is called. And then we're just doing a little fence along here as a barrier, and placing the western hedgerow pieces along the outside. And then I just found a way to sort of place all the different little quarter tile shrubberies along the outside edge. And this is really what creates that sort of natural barrier. I've used that term before, just between the ride and the exterior area. And yeah, just going through with the rest of these plants and making a nice natural uh, floral, not floral, but you know, plant-based barrier, whatever you want to call it, and also placing some tumbleweeds in the town itself to add a little more texture and variety. And finally, we're going through with our safari fence and placing it along this border, um, just to have a proper restricted area fence, and one that's the proper height to keep guests out. Because this park is set in America where we need big fences. I've heard the parks in Europe, for the most part, don't always use big fences because people's common sense over there is a lot more reliable. But I have no comments on that. Anyhow, finally, we're just working on this behind the scenes area, and I thought about putting in some parking spaces, but I ultimately decided just to place the no parking barriers on the outside of the doors. I've done this for other show buildings. Same process, same thing. And when we get to developing the behind the scenes areas along here further, I'll decide if parking spaces right there are necessary. But as of right now, I don't think they are, so I'm going to leave it be. And then lastly, well, yeah, I think lastly actually in the video, we are just putting or continuing the little stone wall barrier along the outside of our pond, and along with the safari fence on the outside edge of that. And now we have a little access path back to the base of the lift hill, perfect for any evacuations or anything like that. And that path will probably be a little hidden from guest view later on. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with that exactly, but I do want to develop that area a little bit with a train station, among other things, and maybe try to put a ride in there. But that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you all for watching along. I hope you've enjoyed this project. I mentioned a few episodes ago, how much of a headache it could be building rides that are sort of interwoven with terrain and go in and out, and even building scenery with the terrain together. It's sort of like the unholy trinity of building a roller coaster tycoon. And so I appreciate you bearing with me, and hopefully this project has shown you that with a little persistence, actually with quite a bit of persistence, you can make a really worthwhile and fulfilling project out of it. And the end product, I hope, in your eyes, I hope you agree with me that the end product is worth it. And this is certainly not as good as it could be, um, but I'd say it's still pretty good in my totally unbiased opinion. I mean, this definitely is probably my best log through mountain type project I've done. But I, in an uncharacteristic way, have been talking over beats. I'm gonna stop.